Good morning. As a new ILAB president, I want to welcome you all and thank you very much for joining us for this important symposium. We are here after our Congress, who gave us the possibility, first of all, to be surrounded by beautiful books, and this opportunity was given to the beautiful town of Oxford. Really appreciate that. But also, I think that some of the speeches and the discussion that were held both in our more convivial and also institutional meetings introduced us to the topic that will be covered today. So new ways of collaboration between libraries, booksellers and collectors. I want to emphasize once again the importance of the symposium organized by ILAB, and I give the example of the last New York symposium, which led to the construction of missing book register that I consider one of the most significant instruments of collaboration, of possible and future collaboration between our world, the booksellers, the libraries, and also to the collectors. I won't steal you more time. I just wanted to thank you once again, the two persons that were mostly involved in the organization of this symposium. And I want to mention our ex-president, Sally Bardon, and our secretary, Angelica Elsner. Thank you again, and now I will leave the microphone to Deborah Coltham. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Mario, for your kind opening remarks. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Bodleian for hosting us today, and to all, again, echoing Mario, to all those in the background who've helped bring this symposium together. I can't begin to imagine how much work has gone into it, and yes, we owe them a big debt of thanks. I'm delighted to be taking on the role of Mistress of Ceremonies, as it were, today, and so we'll briefly take you through how we're going to proceed and touch upon the programme. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers at the start of each session. We'd be grateful if you turn off your mobile phones, put them on airplane mode or turn them off altogether for the duration of the sessions. We have a packed programme discussing some pertinent and thought-provoking topics of concern to us all. There will be a tea break between the first two panels, and then we'll carry on until 1 o'clock for lunch, resuming promptly at 2:15. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience again today, especially after the enforced hiatus of the last couple of years. It's hard to believe that the last ILAB Symposium was in March 2019 at the Grolier Club. It's been a challenging time, but I'm sure that I speak for many when I say that once again, the wonderful collegial spirit of the whole book collecting and book-loving community shone through, with, I suspect, even greater bonds being forged between many of us, as we all individually reached out through the ether from our respective bolt holes in new and innovative virtual ways, supporting each other, seeking solace and community. The love of books really did unite us, cementing friendships and no doubt expanding numerous collections, both public, private, established and burgeoning. With the spirit of coming together in mind, ILAB very much appreciates your willingness to participate today in the latest in a series of collaborative events and programmes between libraries, collectors and booksellers dealing with ownership. Whilst the love of books does indeed unite us, so too does the thrill of the chase for that elusive and long sought-after volume, and this can, and at times clearly does, lead to tensions arising in particular between private collectors and institutions on the question of a book's rightful place. It is this question of where do books belong, competition and cooperation between private and institutional collecting, that we will be exploring first today, discussing a range of ideas. For our second session, our 5 speakers will turn their attention to changes and challenges, navigating the tricky waters of the international movement of antiquarian books in the 2020s. Whilst, fortunately, by and large, we are no longer subject to public health restrictions, the same cannot be true with regards to the movement of books and manuscripts, with increasingly burdensome legal restrictions being experienced by many. How can the trade petition for a balanced approach by governments that would allow antiquarian booksellers and parts of the art trade to trade internationally while respecting the government's efforts to preserve and protect cultural goods? That will be explored in the second session. The 2019 symposium at the Grolier Club explored issues surrounding provenance, theft and forgery, and we return to this theme for our third and final session this afternoon: collaboration, communication, transparency, security affects all. The panel highlighting how joint effects between the trade, institutions and law enforcement organisations can lead to the successful recovery of missing books and engender further international collaboration. The afternoon will conclude with the presentation of the 18th Breslau Prize for Bibliography, and I would encourage you all to stay if you can. It's been a wonderful effort. The jury met in Moderna back in May to work through 99 submitted publications, and the prize will be awarded by the chair, Fabrizio Govi. During his time as president, he's expanded the prize greatly from sort of 30 submissions to 99, and it really is now an incredible research tool, the bibliography itself. So I hope you enjoy the day. Without further ado, I will introduce you to the speakers of the first session, although I'm afraid that you're stuck with me for a little bit longer because I'm the first speaker. So forgive me. So to introduce myself, I'm Deborah Coltham. I run Deborah Coltham Rare Books. I started in Pickering and Chatto as an apprentice to the head of Science and Medicine Department, taking over the role in 1998. I established Deborah Coltham Rare Books in 2006 and continue to specialise in a wide range of scientific and medical subjects. I currently organise and sit on the judging panel of the ABA National Book Collecting Prize. I'm a faculty member of the Annual York Annual Antiquarian Book Seminar, a member of the ABA National Council since 2017. I'm membership secretary and vice president of the association. Dr. Christopher Fletcher, is keeper of special collections at the Bodleian Library. He was formerly a curator of literary manuscripts at the British Library. He is a member of Oxford English faculty and a fellow of Exeter College. Patrick Olson. Patrick is proprietor of his own bookshop, a bookseller in Boston, specialising in early printed European material. He entered the book trade in 2003, spent a decade working in academic libraries in the US as a rare book cataloguer, curator and administrator. He returned to the trade under his own name in 2018. Dr. William Zacks, or Bill, I'm sure you would prefer to be known as, is the director of the Blackie House Library and Museum in Edinburgh. William holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, an MSc and PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and an MLis from California State. In 2013, he was awarded a Doctor of Letters from the University of Edinburgh for his contributions to book curation and bibliographical studies. He is a member of the Roxburgh Club, the Grolier Club, and numerous other bibliographic and antiquarian organisations. And finally, but no less least, Stuart Bennett. Don't know why you were last in the alphabetical order, but anyway. Stuart Bennett is an author and antiquarian bookseller in Charleston, South Carolina. He became a Christie's auctioneer in London in 1976 and started his ongoing rare book business in 1980. He has served as president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and on the committee of ILAB from 2014 to 2022. And he has published widely on both sides of the Atlantic, including the Christie's Collector's Guide, How to Buy Photographs, and Trade Bookbinding in the British Isles. One final note before I start, and I hope I've just exhibited it. We have a number of international members in the audience, so I would ask all the panel members to speak slowly and carefully so that everybody can understand this wonderfully international day today. But I'll hand you over to Stuart.
Thanks, Deborah. Welcome to the ILAB Symposium. We're here to discuss difficult topics, although our first session, Where Do Books Belong?, might seem to many of you as not particularly controversial at all. Especially in the last 75 years or so, books and manuscripts have steadily found their way out of private and into public collections. Most people I speak to agree this is a good thing. Books and manuscripts can be preserved and conserved in a consistent way, and scholars are more readily able to locate and access materials for research. But has the balance shifted too far? Are tax incentives for donated collections still appropriate when multiple copies of many first and early editions are already accessible? And I say this without reference to ongoing digitization. I've heard a few dissidents say that institutions are tombs where books go to die, which makes donors and booksellers their undertakers. We'll be asking for your views on these topics a little later. Is there a valid argument that private collectors bring a focus to materials that might not be seen in a larger institutional context? Maybe more important, do private collectors rescue materials that might otherwise be neglected or discarded? With all this in mind, how can private collectors best collaborate with librarians? And what of the marketplace? Booksellers are temporary custodians and researchers, and their offering materials can sometimes bring interesting and sometimes unintended results, as, say, with the Galileo Siderius Nuncius proved a forgery not so very long ago. The panelists are about to bring their own perspectives to these and other matters, but because this is a forum organized by booksellers, the first question I've asked each panelist to address in their introductory remarks is, if a bookseller acquires something rare and desirable, to whom should it be offered first? An institution or a private collector? And why? I've asked the panelists to take this on in alphabetical order, and we'll start with Deborah Coltham. Thanks very much.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me all right with the mic? Great. Well, in one of the sort of the printed leaflet that went round, the phrase ecosystem was used, and I sort of think that's a rather nice idea that we're all a sort of ecosystem of books, and but in all healthy ecosystems it can be a bit predatory, and obviously there is a bit of a food chain, and so who between libraries and private collections takes precedent in this food chain. Stuart, when he was sort of talking to us about, putting this panel together, he wanted us to each take a stand. And obviously I'm a bookseller and I'm very conscious that I don't want to upset either private or institutions, as they're my bread and butter. And in the, you couldn't possibly assign a, priority to them in this great food chain. Booksellers, if you'd ask Linnaeus to, taxonomically describe booksellers, heaven knows where that would get us. But the thing that sort of struck out is about this idea of materials being accessible to scholars. That's the main thing, is sort of with the vague implication that by being in a private collection, somehow they wouldn't be accessible. And, obviously it's a small business. I really think long and hard about where I'm going to try and place a book. And, I do my best, if obviously it's the Scottish material, I try and head north, and, Cambridge or Oxford, I try and give priority. But, being honest as a bookseller, it's, you just have to... market forces play a force. I think sometimes you just have to sort of put it out there and just see, who's going to bite first. And it's a reality. It's, I would love to be, certainly seeing some of the collections in Bodleian, my instinct is, gosh, everything should go to an institution, but that's not really the case. I'm on the faculty of the York Antiquarian Book Seminar, and I confess that we give a lot of emphasis on teaching the young dealers to supply institutions, But I'm the one that usually sort of says, but we need to keep this healthy ecosystem turning round. And if it's the private collections that are likely to come back on the market, realistically. My very first auction experience at Pickering and Chatto was actually the University of Chicago duplicate library. So, it is proof that happens. But, by and large, it's going to be private institutions that come back and keep this chain moving. And going back to this idea of private collections being inaccessible, I don't think it's completely a preserve of science and medical collections, but actually a lot of our great collectors of the past, like Norman and Tomash and Neville. They've made a great thing of their book catalogues. They've really promoted their scholarship. And going forward to today, actually I won't name him because I think he's in the audience, but there are a couple of noted science collectors who've also just done amazing published catalogues, and one of whom has created an incredible digital interactive source that he's happy to share freely with any private customer so that you can go on and access his books and, for scholarly research. He, interestingly enough, I think is thinking of disposing his collection. He's talking about it going back into the wild, which again rather brings us nicely back to this sort of healthy ecosystem. The other point that we were sort of thinking about is, has it got out of reach for, young collectors? And again, I'm on the book collecting prize, and I'm happy to report that it's very healthy, and they're very innovative. They're not, spending a lot of money. They're creating their own niches, and a lot of which I think are then actually being reflected in institutional collections. They're leading the way in changing the market. So, I mean, I think we do need to keep. Yes, this idea that private collections, I think, are inaccessible is not so true now. And, I'd sort of just conclude by saying, it's a truth universally acknowledged that book collectors love to talk about their collections. And even if not publicly accessible, I suspect that most, even if behind an impenetrable force field, are somehow available, and people would welcome them. Digital copies, of course, will never replace the physical object, but, the idea today that, something will vanish into obscurity, I just don't think is true. And, sharing knowledge has never been easier, certainly as we've all found in the last 2 years. The final point I'd make, is sharing disinformation has also never been easier, unfortunately. And I think it really behoves all of us to be as open as we can. However, we're all custodians, aren't we? We're all curators of the books that we handle. And, I think, as long as we can collaborate. But yes, I think private collections are,
Chris.
Okay, lovely to see you all. I'm not sure I like the idea of libraries as tombs. Yeah. And it brought to mind something that the poet and classicist A.E. Housman once described the Bodleian as. He said the Bodleian was an arsenal of divine vengeance. And what he meant by that was that the Bodleian's in it for the long game, and we look after things, and those things can emerge to bite the assumptions of scholars. And I think, thinking about the long game, I mean, we've been going for over 400 years. It is our mission to make things available to people. And there's a constancy. There's a constancy there, perhaps more than in a private collection, of course. Some of our, a great many of our holdings have come to us by virtue of perceptive private collectors, Dowse, Rawlinson, Malone, to name just a few. So we believe in the private collection. And we hope that many such collections will come to us in the course of time. I'd also say that in my experience, my experience in this world, we work all the time with knowledgeable and sympathetic dealers, as Deborah mentioned, who really know the library landscape and take pleasure in helping us to fill gaps and build collections. And just recently, a particular dealer actually negotiated with a client who had just beaten us to something in order to persuade that client to actually defer to us. Another kind of form of recent interesting collaboration happened with the Honorsfield Library, which Sotheby's was going to auction off and disperse things back. into the ecosystem. And actually, this was the wonderful Honnersfield collection of literary manuscripts and books. And the owners and Sotheby's actually agreed to offer that collection as a whole, to retain its coherence, and offer it by private sale to a consortium of libraries and writers' houses. And we concluded that just recently. Dealers, I know, work with some private collectors in the knowledge that those collectors are intending to leave their collections to a particular institution. So kind of become vicarious advocates for us. Of course, that brings a risk. You know, a collector may say they wish to leave something to a library, but you can't ever depend upon it. And that poses an interesting question for the institution. You know, do they collect things at the risk of duplicating what's going to come to them in due course? Or do they take a risk, not acquire things, hoping that it will come in due course, and then end up with a black hole in their collections? I think just briefly, I'm always conscious that there are questions of fairness. To whom do dealers send out advanced catalogues? I think certainly I get some of those. But I know other dealers who don't do that and send out to private collectors and institutions at the same time. This in turn raises challenges, I think, for institutions in particular in relation to the question of time. You know, we have lots of other responsibilities. We're able to browse sales catalogues, but perhaps not as speedily as a private collector might. There's also a question of money. Collectors, I think, on the whole, probably can respond and pay up quicker. I might be being highly naive here. You in the audience will know more about this than I do, but it's true that institutions tend to take a fair bit of time, often to raise funds or to consult internally. So that requires a certain amount of doubt and patience from the dealer. And then I guess, you know, I think you'll touch on this later, but the whole question of where the collector or the institution actually is and where the dealer is, and all the legislative stuff around that. So those are that's my starter for 10.
Sounds good. Thank you. Patrick.
So my opinions are inevitably shaped by my experience as a curator and librarian. So by putting these books in front of the end user, whether that's a researcher, a student, an exhibit viewer, or even just a curious visitor. So when asked this question, I ask myself, you know, where might this book do the most good? And given the growing outreach programs of so many libraries, not just instruction and exhibits, but informal show and tells and potentially lucrative donor events, my answer to this question is usually an institution. Of course, there's the classic research rationale too. You know, a given work on underwater basket weaving should be offered to the world's largest such collection. That facilitates the researcher's task and thereby benefits scholarship generally. But more and more, I've come to appreciate the extraordinary power of a single book to inspire someone to collect, to inspire someone to become a librarian, to inspire a scholar to explore a new topic, which could do many times more good than that same book sitting on a shelf and maybe providing a single data point in a large research project once in a generation, looking at the classical view that, you know, these books are here for scholars only. And it's true that inspiration can happen anywhere, not just in libraries, but at a book fair, in a bookstore, or even at a private collector's house. So before coming here, I actually crunched some numbers. I was curious what my breakdown was. And by value, my business is about 12% to the trade, over 3/4 to libraries, and just 5.6% to private collectors. So this isn't because I necessarily think institutions are somehow inherently more deserving, even if I tend to think that institutions are where books may do the most good. It's because this is very much a relationship-based business, and libraries and librarians are what and whom I know. I spent 10 years building relationships with librarians as a peer, as a colleague. In truth, I'd love to sell more to private collectors. Not always comfortable with so much of my income stream dependent just on libraries. And really only through willful ignorance can someone deny private collectors' critical role in institutional collection development. I mean, Bodleian is a case in point. And it's no secret that American institutions, for example, have a long history of collection bias, of ignoring incredible swaths of humanity's cultural heritage while competing relentlessly for Shakespeare and Milton and Dickens. And I think we've made great strides in correcting this. Certainly, many U.S. libraries are putting more resources into developing collections that better represent the interests and backgrounds of the broad communities they serve. But I expect the development of collections by private collectors, eventually sold or bequeathed to institutions, will continue to play a major role in filling these gaps. In the end, except in cases of theft and compelling repatriation, and even though I enjoy working with institutions, I generally don't believe any one person or institution is entitled to a given book. The slow march leads inevitably to institutions, to libraries. Maybe that'll take a generation or two for some important items, even longer, but I don't think that's necessarily going to hinder humanity's progress. When I worked at a Midwestern university, I used to joke with a fellow curator that in a few billion years, the sun is going to burn all of this up anyway. Now, that's probably far enough away that it's still worth considering these issues. And so, for now, looking at it, what matters to me is that wherever they go, library, private collector, on a bookseller's shelf, what matters is that they're well looked after in the meantime. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here in the Bodleian and make networking for the next wonderful book that's going to come my way. I look forward to that. I describe myself as an antiquary. I can't even pronounce the word, but really I would say on a good day I'm a serious book collector, scholar. On a bad day I'm just an obsessive shopper. And Patrick's point about the interesting point about the percentage of books that go to the trade is relevant. You're all probably sitting here, well, what is your percentage there? My experience as a collector on the outside is that a lot of the book trade deals, at least initially, are among yourselves. It is not quite reduced to the joke about 5 antique dealers on an island with one chair. You know the joke, the punchline. They all make a profit, but it's that would not go down well in this audience. But it's something to think about. I cut my teeth learning about old books in the monthly and even weekly auctions, very down market, not always down market auctions in Edinburgh and Glasgow. So that was two a month at least, plus the very Dickensian lane sales where books were piled up on tables. But I was told in no uncertain terms by some of the dealers that this was not a place for a private collector to be, that these sales were for the trade. And that, to some degree, has changed. There's a fascinating history, if you're into the history of book collecting and book dealing, of that, in that world, the auction room. And I said to one of these dealers, well, I'll stop going to these auctions when you stop trading books before the book fairs that are meant to be for the public open. Okay, that's not going to get a laugh either, but I'll be contentious. And one time I was asked in Edinburgh, one of the annual Edinburgh ABA sale, to put on a little exhibition, which I was happy to do. They said, well, what would you like? We offer you a book token. I said, no, I want to get into the book fair before it opens, when you guys are doing your wheeling and dealing. They did let me in. I bought one book, and then when I got it home and collated it, it was defective, and I had to return it. But I think that is an exception to the rule, really. We are all, I would argue, book collectors. Dealers are book collectors. Dealers are scholars. You are the unsung scholars in this world. Librarians are as well. Book collectors. People say to me, well, what are your favorite books in your library? And I would really like the shelf to be the books I've written rather than the books I've collected, however wonderful they might be. So it's a complicated story. Deborah referred to the Student Book Collecting Prize, and am really proud to say that I've been, in Scotland in particular, instrumental in setting up 4 of these prizes. And it's not so much, it's not only the cultivation of collecting books, however loosely defined, among young people, among students, but it's an element of the prize that we instituted that, in addition to £500 or whatever it is, the student is giving another sum, £250, in some cases £500, to work with one of the curators, the librarians, to buy a book for the collection that is given in their name. So it instills in that student, and more generally, the idea of giving something back. Chris's point about Deuce and Malone and Rowlandson being the foundation, great collections of institutions, and it's true of just about every other institutional library, wherever you are in the world. In most cases, that's to a great degree where the collections where the books come from. And I don't think there's been a deep analysis about that, but that's a balance between the trade, but buying acquisitions that Chris makes and donations. You can probably come up with percentages, however hard to quantify, among those different areas. And final point, I will interrupt and carry on, of course. Booksellers are also very often great donors to collections. All of you, many of you, will have given books. Maybe it was a book you couldn't sell, but so what? You found the right place for that book, and that institution was grateful. It is all about rapport and relationships, and thinking about where that individual book. Every case is different. Where does that book belong? I would sort of ask the book the question. Where do I want to be, rather than the other way around.
And I thank you all, and we're about to start opening it up between you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I just wanted to point out that the only person who got close to answering the question I posed at the outset was Bill, and I completely and heartily agree. It depends on the book. Where does it belong? But had anyone asked me before, do you think you'll get an answer to your question? To whom should a bookseller offer a special thing first? I would have said, I don't expect an answer, and I didn't get one. So I think we're going to take just a few more minutes where, if the panelists would like to respond to some of the comments that each of you has made, please do dive in. If not, we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, no, you're right. Picking up on that, so I suppose I'm lucky because science and medicine is, well, dare I say it, it's not niche, but it's very specific field, and I've got one or two customers who've got very, very specific collections, and obviously I'm going to, offer the book to them. It's a no-brainer, and some of them, I think, because they're such specific collections, will end up at a library. I think for those with more general collections, and it's understandable that they then might end up back on the market, back into the wild. as it were. But it's interesting, that I'm the same as Patrick. If I'm completely honest, 80% of my sales go to institutions. So it's definitely a case to Yabs of, do as I say and not as I do, suggesting this broader idea of, making sure we have a balance. But,
One of the questions that I'd like to pose to the panel, and then we'll open it up, is institutions used to sell more duplicates than they do now. Is there such a thing as a duplicate? Should institutions who have multiple copies offer perhaps the least desirable of those copies back into the marketplace, or is there a case to be made that that there could be stop press corrections? Or obviously, an annotated copy is unique and worthy of preserving however many of the printed copies you might have. But what about printed duplicates? And I'd like to pose this question first to Chris. One sees old British Library duplicate stamps back, but not so much the Bodleian.
Well, it's all, how do you define a duplicate?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to give you an answer.
No.
It's a mixed picture. We're happy to take duplicates if they form part of a discrete collection, perhaps. In other instances, we might be donated duplicates that we can sell. We would never sell anything or get rid of anything we'd accessioned. It depends. It depends on the circumstance. It depends on the book.
Well, in 1915, I think you bought your most expensive book, which was a Shakespeare First Folio. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was 1906.
1906.
Henry Folger offered £3,000. It took us a year to raise the money.
This was a book that had come into the Bodleian when it was published.
Yep.
And then deaccessioned when the third edition, the better edition, came out, and then was sensibly bought back. So
you're trying to shame me, Bill.
No. I think the point is that you rose to the occasion and said, this is a book we shouldn't have, or circumstances were different then. Now we're going to go for this book. That's the point, because that was a huge amount of money at the time to buy something back that you just had probably given away or sold for 6 shillings.
I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who might like to offer a perspective, a continental perspective, because we have an Anglo-American panel here. Marcus, is that you? Yeah. Well,
it's great to be here. This is my first congress I have been to, so I'm quite astonished to learn so much about the American and the English and the Anglo-Saxon Anglophone point of view. Does anybody hear me? Yeah. It's a great experience, and it gives me a very much sensation of new things I've never known before. So just to tell you a little bit of the German situations, I'm holding auctions. I worked plenty of years for antiquarian book dealers, retailing books, and now auction books. When I hear what Deborah said, that she's selling 80% to institutions, or Patrick, I think it was 12% to collectors, but three quarters to institutions, more or less, if I understood it right. Then I can say, my God, wow, great, yeah. I would like to sell 50% or even 30% to institutions. That's part. My father has been a librarian. He was the head of the manuscript department in Berlin. And of course, he bought a lot of books, and he was a great fundraiser when he wanted to have a special book, a manuscript, even like like a very important, famous, with some millions. He could afford it because he went on getting the money. But still, there's only a small percentage in the last, let's say, 20 years where the public hand can buy. This is part of the fact that, of course, in Germany as in Europe, the great libraries, they have the most of the famous books or important books they have already in their stocks. Though there are plenty of losses in the war, but even today there are lots of war. So when I make my research in a bibliography, or I look it up in an online catalog in an OPAC, I realize it's still a loss of the war, and I have the book and I like to sell it, and the library says no, we can't buy it. You know, so it's totally different from that what I heard here, and what interests me is what other points of view maybe from other European dealers are, but this is the case. So when I'm as an auctioneer sell, let's say 15-12% to public libraries, I would be happy. So on the other side, it means that, of course, I deliver most of my books to private collectors and to the trade. I think the trade, okay, in the point of view of an auction, the trade is very important. I'm still in the old school where we are as grossists delivering the books to the trade as an auction house. But when I was a retail dealer like a antiquary book dealer, there was fed private collections and other dealers, so like on the island, yeah. But still, I mean, it would be a wish if public library could buy more. So I could be proud right now for all the books that are taken by private collectors, because then I know the book is in a safe place and it will be probably go back to the market and once go to a library.
Thank you, Marcus. Would the panel like to respond to that, or shall we take more questions?
Well, I was just going to sort of echoing that issue. I mean, obviously we've just had those of us at Congress have had a fabulous few days talking to people, and actually one or two of I was talking to a couple of Australian dealers, and again I think it's the same. I think some of their libraries are possibly constrained by funding. Obviously, I think Bodleian, you've clearly got sufficient funds, but a lot of the problem
Never sufficient.
But I mean, again, going back to the market forces, I think I sell a lot to the US. The funding is better for the libraries. I mean, and sadly, there's not much that we can do about that. And so, if I heard one tell of someone offering an amazing item to an Australian library, and they just couldn't do it. They couldn't find the funds. They assumed it would be donated. That was kind of how they were looking at it.
Thank you.
I was thinking, this ties into the earlier question as well about, should libraries sell duplicates, and that's something I'm a firm believer in. But in my experience, I worked for a lot of public institutions, and one of the real challenges of buying things, especially at auction, is institutions, the ones I work for, and I think most in the United States, will not pay for something before it's shipped. They only pay after they receive it, which cuts out a tremendous chunk of potential sources for new acquisitions. And it's true, for selling duplicates as well. I think it would be fantastic to have an easier method to sell duplicates and use those funds to buy material that would better complement your collections, better serve your users. But functionally, the books are state-owned property, and the channels you often need to go through to sell a $100 duplicate are extraordinary. And so I think a lot of librarians are sympathetic to the idea of selling duplicates, moving some of this unnecessary material back into the trade. But yeah, I think the red tape at so many institutions really hinders a lot of what both the trade, private collectors, and even the librarians would like to see. But their hands are tied by administrations they can't control.
No, I think we'd have £1 million for the number of times You know, we've tried to offer a book to a library, and the answers come back, no, I can't buy it because it's 20 miles away. You know, they've got a copy. You know, they're so strung by regulations at times, which obviously private collectors can't, and they can expand and evolve, whereas I think the libraries can be a bit tied up.
Audience questions? Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't see you, but the lady on just there on the right, our right.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cusk, and I'm the Rare Books cataloguer at Lincoln College here in Oxford. And I'd like some advice. So it's happened to me recently in the last few years that I've been made aware of a book that has a kind of Lincoln provenance or some connection to the college has come on the market, and there's no way we can afford it. And in one instance, I was allowed to look at it because I knew the dealer. But is there an argument to be made that someone in my position should have access or could have access to a book as it's going on the market, or have a relationship with the eventual buyer if it goes to an individual and not to an institution?
Panel?
Yes, how would that work? What would I do? I see a book and I know that it's sold for £60,000, which we couldn't possibly afford, or the estimate is between.
Let me just clarify. So an association with your college.
Well, it's mainly, as far as I'm concerned, there'll be a book that's from a library that's also represented in our college library, an individual library,
Right.
a donor, and I might want to compare that copy with something that we have in our library, or it adds to our understanding of what that individual's library was like. So I would like a bit of access to the book before it disappears. So from my perspective, disappears.
I think we should ask the Bodley keeper to respond in the first instance, if you don't mind, Chris.
I mean, I think if there's a book you're interested in and you're wanting to see it and it's disappeared into a private collection, what I would suggest is you get in touch with the particular dealer or auction house and ask them to pass on your request to the purchaser. They're unlikely to reveal the name of that person, but we've had instances where something has sold, we haven't been able to acquire it or what have you, and dealers have subsequently passed on expressions of our interest.
I have tried that and have yet to be successful. So the dealers have passed it on, but I haven't heard back, and clearly that's the individual buyer's prerogative.
It's hard to know what to do in that case.
Any other comments?
I mean, as it sounds like you've asked, and certainly as a bookseller, I would not be the least bit offended if you asked, could you pass this message along, or if I had it, if I still had it, if you wanted to see it, I'd be happy to show it to you, send you photos, so that I guess I wouldn't feel any trepidation about pursuing that path and it before the book is sold. Yeah.
Perhaps add a nice invitation to some college dinner or something as part of what you're...
There we go.
I would just like to echo the comment from my colleague from Germany. I mean, I sell to institutions, maybe, 40, 50%, but it's almost exclusively to North American institutions, to maybe one Canadian institution, and the rest are US institutions, and occasionally there's one or two others. So I think it's a very, in some ways, that's quite a skewed view. Institutional capabilities are actually quite limited in other parts of the world.
I would add a comment about the dynamic for the private collector buying something that he or she may know perhaps belongs more obviously in an institution. I'm seriously collecting Scottish books, for example, but I'm about 100 yards from the National Library of Scotland and about 500 yards from the University of Edinburgh. So do I fight it out with them in the auction rooms? Do I try to persuade the dealer that he should offer me this book? Do I stand back, as I often do, but not in every instance, and say that's the institution? Or do I say, well, okay, let me buy that book, and I will make some pledge or some promise or even just have the idea that eventually that book will come to the public institution. So those are choices, but it's the sort of the point, I think, is that communication, collaboration, and I used the T word, trust, can really inform that dynamic about finding out where do books really belong. Chris has made the point that it's a journey, 400 years plus in the case of the Bodleian Library, but even if it's a shorter journey, what are the benefits of handing it over to the private collector with a view to finding the ultimate place for that book? And at the same time, people ask me, well, what are you doing with all of these books? Where are they going to go? And that's a question, a separate topic for a group of collectors maybe, but dealers have a role in that too, in helping facilitate those decisions, both for the private collector and the institution.
Thank you, Bill. I think it's worth pointing out, too, that with Bill, as an American living in Edinburgh, some of his acquisitions, which might be from dealers not in the UK, will very likely find their way back to Scotland and might well stay in Scotland. Whereas what we're hearing, I think, mostly, and I think what most of us who've been in the trade for some considerable while are aware of, is that there has been essentially a giant sucking sound of material going from the European and British side of the Atlantic to the North American side. Is there another question? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Helen Vincent, and I work at the National Library of Scotland. Hi, Bill. And yeah, we have, I will say, we have sometimes duked it out over...
unknowingly, even.
Yeah, exactly. But you're a great person to collaborate with. I think you're a model of a generous collector who does share things. And also, from the library perspective, I think we're both allowed to have our perspectives as a collector and as a institution. And as long as you think books are property, people are entitled to own property, people are entitled to want to own property. So I feel like we're both allowed to ask booksellers, me first, please. And it's up to the bookseller to make that adjudication. I have a question for the panel. And I also wanted to say, I'm here from the National Library of Scotland. I'm also here from the International Federation of Library Associations, IFLA. We have a liaison group between IFLA and ILAB, which is exactly about bridging the gaps and where possible, being on the same page about issues about theft, trafficking in particular. And so I really hope we can talk about those later today. My question is about the use people make of books and making things available to scholars who want to consult a book or to read it versus the other kinds of things people want to do. They want to add it to a union catalogue, they want metadata, they want the provenance information for a database. So there are these kind of digital humanities, digital scholarship and online uses of books increasingly. And how do you feel about that, given that quite a lot of the time private collectors aren't necessarily part of that digital landscape?
That's a great question. Let's open it up.
Well, my first thought is yes, and I agree. I think on the whole, a lot of private collections aren't digitally accessible, but I think that's going to change. As I say, his name's David DeLaura, and he collects optical books, and he's very happy for me to say that to you. This database he's created is amazing, and you can compare. He's created a timeline. He's comparing the books in the period. You can look at it, and he's happy to share that. So I think things are changing. I definitely think things are changing, and there are some great collaborations. I mean, not just Bill, Lisa Baskin at Duke and her amazing Women in Work collection, and that's very accessible. There's Florence Farrington. It's a whole history. I mean, obviously, but Bolly back, but people are working together and opening things up, I think.
I'm generally in favor of any non-destructive use. So if with the understanding that any use is slow wear and tear, but yeah, I wouldn't discriminate, I guess, against one use or the other. I think.
Can I ask, would you encourage people to report things or to add them, add things to ESTC, which does have a facility for private ownership, or any other kind of shared catalogue information like that?
Would I encourage private collectors and book dealers, or that's a good question.
Well, I think I would just quickly respond. The last time, and admittedly it was decades ago, I reported a significant bibliographical variant to ESTC. They replied that they weren't interested in hearing from dealers and private collectors.
Interesting. So
I think that may have changed, but it's put me off.
Well, Helen and I have had two interesting encounters. I mean, chapter in my memoirs about copies, complete and incomplete, of the very first book printed in Scotland. But the most recent example I'll just briefly describe, and you can perhaps comment as well. This was one sheet of the folded sheet of which survived as binding of the first book printed in Scotland. But interestingly, it had been deaccessioned by an institution, Downside Abbey School, a long-established Catholic school, who had received it, I think, as a donation. So there's a long chain of provenance there. Now, I don't know if you were bidding on that book, or were you bidding on that book?
That is exactly the kind of thing where I think it's great. We weren't actually, and
Okay.
I actually did think. I think if we step back, I know who might buy it.
Well, this was a case where we didn't collaborate. It was a sort of a last-minute thing for me. I bought it in a Sotheby's auction. It was grouped in with 29 other bits of manuscript waste, and an email came the next day from Sotheby's. We've received this letter from Helen at the National Library. Are you, so immediately I responded, yes, here, you haven't come in to see it yet, but, well, that's another story. We'll follow up. So that book, at least, I mean, I didn't want that book to get too far away. So the book is literally 100 yards from the National Library. To compare it with other manuscript scraps from the very same book. So, it's a good result without actually any communication, but that's just lucky, I think. We want to do more together. You're all our witnesses.
There. Other questions? There.
Christian White, bookseller. I'm fascinated that in a room where there are lots of booksellers, we're kind of pushing back against the idea that when a book ends up in a library, it's there for good. And I think the idea, Stuart, that you started with of libraries as that scary notion of libraries as tombs is one that kind of has to be explored more, because one of the most stimulating online lectures that I listened to during the horrible COVID lockdowns was by Joe Marshall, obviously now National Library of Scotland. And he talked about the fact that with 18th and 19th century books increasingly digitized and with copy specifics much less significant there than in earlier printed books, surely there may come a moment when libraries decide wholesale to start deaccessioning 18th and 19th century books, not the earlier ones, but that period. And I just wonder, without it being purely self-interest, whether we are approaching that moment.
Let's ask Chris and Patrick to respond first.
I mean, I think about this a lot lately from the American perspective, because of the demographics of college enrollment. So there are hundreds, maybe thousands of small colleges and universities throughout the United States that have tiny little but sometimes spectacular rare book collections. And college enrollment is on the decline, and births are not keeping up with that, and we've already seen a number of smaller colleges merging with others. So I imagine over the course of the next century, I would expect a lot of these small universities, colleges, as they merge with others or shut down altogether, there'll be some serious conversations about what to do with, in some cases, some fairly large book collections, and that some of those probably will wind up back on the market. I don't know if it's going to compare to the closing down of English country houses and monasteries in the Reformation, but I generally don't think that once a book goes into a library, it's there for good. All kinds of things can push it back out.
No.
Good. That's I would just comment too that in terms of what Patrick was saying, that what you've proposed, Christian, seems to me a much more logical thing. That where you have essentially, particularly in the 19th century, mechanized book production, that duplicate copies could perfectly reasonably be sold. But in some cases, particularly where American institutions come under financial pressure, what you see is the stars of their, the brightest stars in their bibliographical firmament coming on the market. For example, when Mills College recently sold its Shakespeare First Folio, and really quite a nice copy of Shakespeare's First Folio, and it was essentially a stopgap sale. And I think that we may see more pressure for those kinds of things. Is this a good thing? Does a small college in the East Bay of California need to have a copy of the First Folio? Who knows? I'm not gonna judge, but I think it's a great question. We've got time for one more question before we're gonna have to wrap up. Is there another question? Yeah, Paul.
Excuse me. Paul Mills, bookseller, no connection with Mills College, I hasten to say. And forgive me, this is perhaps a waste of the last question, but can I ask our library representative where digitization comes into this? I mean, surely as time goes on, everything is going to be digitized and will be very much more easily accessible to everyone. I mean, the internet is in its very early stages, I think, although we think it's been around now for decades. If a point where everything is digitized, will that make them books accessible? And it begs the question then, why would public institutions waste, I hasten, or softly to say, spend public money which could be spent on education rather than competing to buy an expensive copy to put in a library, which will make it much less accessible, or will then need to be digitized?
We teach a lot of students from Oxford here in the Bodleian, and seeing their response to handling a book is incredible, and that will never be replaced by the digital. So the analog is important. That's one thing. I think the second thing is we try to digitize as much as we can, and we have a huge number of images on our digital.bodleian website, but it's an expensive business. You don't just need a camera and a computer, you need people who can understand what the image is, who can describe it, so on and so forth. It's also very expensive to keep. And I guess the other thing is just the sheer volume of material that big libraries have. So you can do a certain amount, and then there are issues of, particularly with more modern materials, sort of modern archives, questions of copyright, questions of data sensitivity, so on and so forth. So there's always going to be some stuff that's in a kind of digital penumbra that you won't be able to image. So I think librarians, they embrace the digital, but it's not going to replace the book. I guess a bigger question is to do with the digital preservation of born digital materials. So what are libraries doing in respect of collecting websites? How do they deal with emails, social media as part of archives? And indeed, what is the stance of booksellers on this? I mean, I don't know if people here have sold archives to institutions, but what do you do if they have a digital component? How can you package them up for an institution? How can you actually put a value on them? Do people walk away from that element of an archive and it subsequently just gets lost? Or is there a position that dealers could take, particularly in terms of collaboration we've been talking about, to work with some of their clients to make sure that the digital aspects of their collections, thinking particularly of archival collections, are actually kept?
And that is a question for another day. Thank you all for coming.